Just talk about just some general design patterns that I use at a bunch of different places I've worked, actually. And I found them to be good for a variety of different scenarios, from web automation to what I work on now, which is some UI automation in Flash, actually. I don't know why this is small. So what is effective automation? What am I going to talk about in this presentation? I'm going to talk about what it is. I'm going to explain some of the benefits, why I actually do it. There's obviously a couple drawbacks to it that I've encountered throughout the years, and I'm going to give the Selenium example because it is a Selenium meetup. So I use a pattern of creating APIs that I use as just basic functions or methods, so that'd be something like login, so you'd use that to log into your site. I also use them for any kind of repeated action. Repeated actions are, so I don't know how many of you have used the Netflix UI, probably a bunch of you, but there's a gallery, and so I have in my automation, I have a function that basically goes to the top every time. So it's a repeated action. It's not really a function contained within itself, but it's something that I use often enough that it's worth having an API for. I also use it for separation from kind of a code base to the test cases, so that when you actually look at your test case, you can see what exactly it's doing, and you're not looking at a bunch of nested if, while, for loops. So you can actually go through the test case and read it as if those actions were being taken. I also use it for to simplify code. So this is an example of either WebDriver using Selenium. I'm not too familiar with it, but I put it together. So the top one is what you would do if you wanted to access an element within an element versus creating an API to click something where you just call a function and pass an array of the values LID, LName, and the name that you're looking for. So obviously this is a lot more human readable, and it really does simplify your code when you're looking at it. So that's kind of what it is. Now, what are the benefits? Like I've already alluded to a lot of the benefits that you'll see, but I'll just touch on them a little bit more before giving some examples of it. So as I've stated before, you simplify your code base a lot. So you're looking at, instead of anything that I use more than once, essentially, I'll usually write a function for, because it ends up looking a lot neater in your test cases, and you're not writing code over and over again. And even copy and pasting, it seems efficient at the time, but you always end up having to change it in the future because all of a sudden the website changes or your UI changes. Then you have to change it in multiple places, and that's not something that you want to have to be doing. It also allows you to do something that has allowed us to do something very interesting at Netflix, which is we have a lot of different people who are at different levels in terms of their experience in either the language we're dealing with or just automation in general. And so we've kind of separated a little bit where we have people who are very familiar with coding, and they'll write a lot of the APIs. And then we have people who are less familiar, and they can write the test cases because there are enough APIs, and it's simple enough to say, go to website, log in, click this object, see if this object exists. So it's simple enough that you're not having to deal with the common structures of code like loops and conditional statements. And so whenever somebody actually needs a new API, they just file a bug or a task for it, and then it gets created. You also decrease coding time, because once you have all these APIs in place, you can take writing a test case down from hours potentially to a couple minutes. So I'm at the point now where I can write test cases for stability that are not feasible to do manually. I can write them in about 5 minutes now because I have all those APIs already in place. And as I've already said, you can simplify your test code based on the example that I gave. So there's obviously are some drawbacks to this. And so there's the whole maintenance and upkeep. So you'd think there'd be less maintenance when you take this kind of strategy, but sometimes there ends up being hidden problems where you create these APIs and you use them in a lot of different ways, and you start to use them in ways you didn't originally plan. So you're starting to do certain steps after the fact. And you say, okay, I'm going to refactor this API because every time I log in, I always go to this web page. And then you don't realize that you're using it in a whole bunch of other different places, and it starts to break a bunch of your test cases. So you have that issue there. There's the large initial overhead. So when you're writing all these APIs, it takes a lot of time, and you want to be relatively careful about how you write them because there's something that's going to be used over and over again, and you want to be efficient about them. So you're not going to be banging out test cases right away. You're going to have this overhead of writing all these APIs as you go, apparently. Okay. you also have the question of when to create APIs. So I said that I usually create them if I do something more than once, but sometimes I'll sit there and think about it for 10, 15 minutes, what I want to send to the API, what I want back. And so I end up using all this time trying to figure out how to do it, and I end up kind of wasting a bit of time because I'll pigeonhole in how to do it perfectly when I should be looking at just getting the work done. And then you get to the case where I'm kind of sitting now where I actually have, at times, too many APIs, and I've actually written APIs that do the exact same thing more than once. And I'll go look and I'll say, and I'll see that I have the same one that does the exact same thing because I forgot that I wrote it, essentially. And that can be mitigated by having some separation in terms of like having some discipline about separating your classes out intelligently. Because at this point, a lot of my APIs are just in one giant class, or it's in one file that has multiple classes, but I find that I forget what's in there because it's getting to the point where it's at 1,000, 2,000 lines, and so it's easy to get lost. So, as I said, there's a Selenium example because it is a Selenium meetup, and they said I had to do something Selenium related. So I did learn a little bit of Selenium to do this. I'm familiar with Water, and so I'm familiar with web automation in general, but Selenium was a little bit new. It took me a while. This actually does work. I'm not going to actually do a demo, but I made sure it works. So this is basically what this is going to the Netflix website, going to your instant queue, and deleting the first item in your queue. So as you can see, if you looked at that, would you be able to tell what this is doing? Not right off the bat. I'm sure if you sat down and read it for a couple minutes, you'd realize what was going on. So but something like this, if you use APIs a lot, can go to something like this, where you're looking at something a lot more human readable, where you have things like, login was in the previous one. It was too long to fit on the one slide. But you have things like go to at Netflix electronic delivery URL. Then you have things like object, so it's if object exists, and then there's the object. So it's at this point, it's more or less pseudocode and human readable. And these are all functions that I actually did create for the Selenium. So you also have, this is an example of the login function I wanted to show you. So you can also get, so it's relatively simple. It uses the APIs that, so for example, the click object and the set object APIs. And so I'll just explain briefly. I define the add class variables in Ruby, and I define them as every element I always look for one with an ID, and then I provide how I'm going to find it and then what it is. So like name and what that name is. And so I do that just because a lot of websites these days are very dynamic, and a lot of things will have the same properties within different areas of the page. So finally, this is an example of the click object API. So basically it checks if the, as I said, it just looks for, you pass it the object array that you define in your class, and it basically just evaluates the string. This is pretty simple at this point, but at one point in time, if you actually look at the click object I have for the Ruby, the water-based one, there's about 5 or 6 different conditional statements that handle things like if you pass it an href, it treats it as a regular expression, because in general you're not looking for the whole one, you're looking for a portion of it. You can pass the regular expression, it handles it properly. You can just pass it the actual element and it'll handle it properly. So every time, so you can, when you have these kind of functions, you can basically build them out so that you can handle a lot of different cases, and you're still looking at that same click object that is very pleasant to look at. So questions, comments, feedback?
Have you looked at page objects or other object-oriented frameworks?
Not particularly. I tend to stay away from frameworks in general. I like to build my own. That's why this is the first time I looked at Selenium. I started using Water probably, the first time was probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, like when it was first getting started. And I just kind of stuck to it because I liked the freedom it offered in terms of, like, going to Selenium was a little bit difficult because I'm not familiar with the syntax, and I was trying to make it conform to my Ruby roots, essentially. Yeah.
So you talked about some maintenance and some other challenges. I don't suppose you have to do any sort of analysis to determine what kind of savings over time, based on the amortization of all the.
So I haven't had it running long enough to, or I have a lot of trouble time saving kind of metrics because so a lot of time I remember I've been asked this where they'll say how many minutes does it take you to write each test case? And that's a really ambiguous question that really isn't that useful. If somebody ever asked me that question, I'd sit down and explain to them that that's not the question you want to ask. The question I don't say in those words exactly, but I kind of explained to them that's not a metric that's overly useful. But so back to the time savings, it's really hard to tell. That's only one of the benefits that I see, and that's more or less. I don't know because with the maintenance you end up incurring, it might break even, but I feel like you get a lot more benefits of taking this kind of development strategy over just having you're basically taking all the reusable portions of the large code base and refactoring them down just to functions instead of using them all the time. So I feel like that gain, even if you spent more time writing it, is probably worth it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. Just with what with what he was saying, just like if you could just answer your amortization question, like if there's like some simple things like logging in, clicking buttons, and I saw you had like a wait for element present.
Yeah.
Sort of deal.
Well, and those kind of things they also get complicated to have in your normal code because you can have a lot of different cases when you want to wait for an element to exist, right?
Yeah. So I think like for some of like the wait times when you never know, like you don't want to explicitly say wait 20 seconds when you can just kind of pull every, like half a second to see what's going on.
Well, you can have them, when you have the function, you can have it configurable too. You can have it, so in Ruby, you can have the default value written into the function, and then you can just pass it the value you want to use. So you can always use a different timer. You can wait for the object not to exist, and you can all do that within the same function, essentially, and just pass a different variable. So it's not even, you can write functions that do multiple things that way. Anyways.
We'll just have questions.
One quick, really quick.
So I don't use web automation too much anymore. I deal with TVs and Blu-ray players, so we have our own custom framework that we built. I still use it a little bit to automate the website when I need to, but yeah, I don't use web automation too much. And when I do, I'll use something familiar to me because I need to bang it out quickly.